The story was told as a footnote, a single sentence in a much longer inventory of objects. The letter was found in a box. The box was in a room. The room was part of a collection of belongings that had been packed, moved, sorted, and stored in the years after Michael Jackson's death. The letter was handwritten. It was addressed to someone whose name was not made public. It was signed Michael. It had never been sent. That is the version of the story that most people know, if they know it at all. The version that takes longer to understand is not about where the letter was found. It is about what the letter was. What it meant that a man who had spent his entire adult life being interpreted by other people had put his own words on paper, addressed them to someone, and then kept them without sending them. Not destroyed, not forgotten. Kept. He had been, throughout his career, a complicated writer. He wrote lyrics, some of them remarkable pieces of work that operated simultaneously as pop melody and as something more interior, more precise, more resistant to easy interpretation than most of what surrounded them. He wrote in notebooks. People who worked closely with him in recording sessions described him producing written notes, ideas, references, fragments of melody written in a shorthand that sometimes required translation. He was not a public writer in the way that some artists are. He did not give long written interviews or publish essays or contribute to debates in any written forum. His public communication had almost always been through performance, through his music, or through the specific formal context of carefully managed press appearances. The handwritten letter found among his belongings was different from any of that. It was not a lyric. It was not a note to himself. It was addressed to another person. It was private in the most fundamental sense. It existed only between the person who wrote it and the person it was meant for, and the person it was meant for had never received it. The question of why it was never sent is the question that the story has been circling for years without arriving at a clean answer. There are many possible answers. The simplest is also probably the most accurate. That the act of writing what you feel and the act of sending what you wrote are two different things, requiring different levels of courage, and that sometimes the first is possible and the second is not. This is not a failure. It is a condition of being alive in the specific way that sensitive people are alive, fully aware of what they feel, not always able to cross the distance between what is felt and what is communicated. Michael Jackson, who had spent decades communicating enormous things to enormous audiences, was not exempt from this particular human difficulty. If anything, the specific skill of large-scale public expression may have made private expression harder rather than easier. When you are fluent in one language, the language you have not mastered can feel insurmountably foreign. There is a version of Michael Jackson's life that is almost completely documented. His childhood is on film: Ed Sullivan, The Tonight Show, American Bandstand, dozens of television appearances from before the age of 12. His adolescence is on record: the off-the-wall sessions, the early interviews, the transition from child performer to young adult artist that Quincy Jones engineered with specific precision. His 20s are on film and tape and vinyl. Thriller, the Motown 25 performance, the Beat It video, the moment on a stage in 1983 when he stepped backward across a floor and the world understood that something had happened that had not happened before. His 30s and 40s and the last years of his life, documented, recorded, photographed, analyzed, litigated, broadcast. The handwritten letter was not part of the documentation. Michael Jackson was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most thoroughly documented people of the 20th century. His performances were filmed. His interviews were broadcast. His voice was recorded in studios across 3 decades. His movements were tracked by photographers whose job was specifically to be present wherever he was. His legal proceedings were televised. His public appearances were recorded by audiences with cameras. His entire professional life, from the age of 6, when he first performed with his brothers in Gary, Indiana, had been lived in the presence of other people watching. The handwritten letter was one of the very few things about Michael Jackson that was not witnessed by anyone else while it was being made. The people who handled his estate in the years after his death described the letter in general terms: its handwriting, the care with which it was composed, the fact that it was clearly not a first draft, but a deliberate final version that had been revised and rewritten before being copied out in the form in which it was found. It was not a casual note. It was something that had been worked on. Someone had spent time on it. The recipient, the person whose name was not made public, was, according to those who saw the letter, someone from Michael's life rather than from his professional career. Not a collaborator, not a colleague. Someone from the personal territory that Michael Jackson guarded most carefully. The territory that was most rarely mapped by any of the documentation that had followed his public life. In the specific context of a life as extensively observed as Michael Jackson's, the discovery of something that was unobserved, something that happened in private, that was written and kept and never transmitted, is not a footnote. It is, in a particular way, the heart of something. Because the thing that most people spend their lives trying to understand about Michael Jackson, the gap between the performer and the person, the question of who was actually inside the phenomenon, is exactly the kind of question that a handwritten, unsent letter answers in a way that 40 years of recordings and interviews and performances cannot. A recording is a performance. An interview is a performance. A concert is a performance. A handwritten letter, drafted carefully, addressed to a specific person, kept in a box without being sent, is none of those things. It is simply a person trying to say something to someone, in the absence of an audience, in the absence of a stage, in the absence of the medium that had been his home for as long as he could remember. By the time the letter was found, in the months and years of sorting and cataloging that followed June 2009, the people handling his estate were working through a collection of belongings that was itself a kind of documentation. The objects that had accumulated around a person over the course of a life spent mostly in motion, moving between Neverland Ranch and Las Vegas and Los Angeles and international destinations, accumulating the ordinary and extraordinary material of a very particular existence. There were notebooks, there were drafts of song ideas, there were photographs, personal and professional. There were objects that meant nothing to anyone except the person who had chosen to keep them. The letter was among these, not displayed, not filed in any professional category, simply present among the personal things. People who knew Michael well described him, in the later years of his life, as someone who understood communication through performance more completely than through any other medium. The specific vocabulary of a concert, the lighting cues, the choreography, the arrangements, the way a note was sustained past the point where breath should run out, was not just a professional skill for Michael Jackson. It was the language in which he was most fluent, the one in which he could say things that he could not find words for in other contexts. The music had been his primary form of expression since before he had fully developed the capacity for formal language. Writing a letter was different. A letter requires you to commit to the words. It requires you to make sentences from the indefinite material of feeling. It requires you to say, in a form that cannot be revised by a new performance the next night, what you mean. Not what the song means, not what the choreography suggests, but what you, specifically, are trying to communicate to a specific other person. The fact that Michael Jackson wrote such a letter and then kept it without sending it is not difficult to understand if you know anything about what it feels like to write something that is more honest than you can commit to delivering. What it tells us, not about the content, but about the existence of the thing itself, is something that the documented exterior of a very public life can only suggest and never confirm. That behind the documentation, behind the recordings and the footage and the legal proceedings and the magazine covers and the concert films, there was a person, a specific, individual person who sat down at some point and wrote something he felt to the person he felt it toward, and then, for reasons that cannot be fully known, kept it in a box, in a room, among his belongings, for the rest of his life. The letter still exists. It belongs to his estate. It is not available to the public. The person it was addressed to has not spoken publicly about it. The story of Michael Jackson, in its public form, is enormous. Decades of documentation, analysis, testimony, and interpretation that constitute one of the most thoroughly examined lives in modern cultural history. The letter is a single sheet of paper. It is addressed to one person. It was written by hand. It was never sent. Everything that was never said or performed or recorded or photographed, the interior life of a person who spent the better part of 50 years being observed from outside, fits somewhere in the space between the person who sat down to write the letter and the person who put it in a box without sending it. That space belongs to Michael Jackson. The letter said things that are private. That is why they have not been made fully public, and why the people who know what it contained have spoken about it only in terms that preserve the essential privacy of the content. What has been said is that the letter was, in its tone, not what most people would expect from Michael Jackson as they understood him from his public life. It was not grandiose. It was not formally composed in the way that public statements are composed. It was direct in the specific way that something written with no intention of being read by an audience is direct. The kind of directness that is only possible when you are not performing for anyone. He had been performing for audiences since he was 6 years old. He had refined the art of performance to a level that most musicians spend entire careers trying to approach. The specific skill of knowing what an audience needs, of reading a room from a stage, of calibrating intensity and vulnerability and joy and power to the specific emotional requirements of a moment in a concert. This was something Michael Jackson had been developing and refining for more than 40 years by the time he died. The letter was not a performance. It was a communication from one specific person to one other specific person, written in private, kept in private, found in private. The specific content belongs to the people it was intended for, what it required to write the letter. The specific act of translating feeling into the formal constraint of sentences on paper addressed to a real person was not the kind of thing that fame or talent makes easier. Fame provides audience. Talent provides medium. Neither of them closes the distance between what you feel and what you are able to say to the specific person you feel it toward. That distance is one of the most ordinary human facts, present in every life regardless of scale. Michael Jackson's life was, by every external measure, extraordinary. The letter is evidence that the interior of that life contained the same ordinary difficulties as any other, the same gap between what is felt and what can be expressed, the same hesitation at the threshold between having written something and committing to having said it. He wrote the letter. He kept it in a box. Someone found it 25 years after he wrote it, or 15, or 10. The precise date of composition was not established with certainty, only that it predated his death. The person who was supposed to receive it still has not received it. The music that Michael Jackson recorded and released and performed for 40 years still exists, in every medium that music travels through. Every note is preserved. Every performance can be heard again. The letter exists, too, in a different kind of silence.